200 of the most powerful people in Boston stood frozen in that ballroom, and not one of them was breathing. The music had stopped mid-song. In the middle of the floor stood a maid, 27 years old, black uniform, wine soaking through her sleeve, both eyes wide open and seeing absolutely nothing. Sophia Bell couldn't have told you where the door was. She couldn't have told you where the walls were. 20 minutes earlier, the room had simply started dimming, like somebody was slowly turning the world down, and now there was only sound. A woman's voice cut through it, sweet as frosting. "She's drunk, and she's got my earring in her apron." Nobody moved to help her. In that house, you didn't help the help, not with Fausto Castellani standing 40 feet away. 38 years old, black suit, hands folded, the man who ran every dock, every union, and every quiet arrangement from Southie to the North End. People said he'd stopped feeling things a long time ago, and nobody in that room had ever seen anything to prove them wrong. So they waited for him to do what men like him always do, cut the girl loose and save the alliance. Then a cane struck the marble. Rosalind Castellani, 73 years old, his mother, crossed that entire ballroom on legs that hadn't carried her across a room unassisted in 2 years. She took the blind girl's shaking hand. She walked her slowly, painfully, past every powerful person in New England, and she stopped in front of her son. And she placed that maid's hand into the hand of a Mafia boss. Then she looked up at him and asked one question. "Would you dance with her?" Fausto looked at his fiancée. He looked at her father. He looked at 200 people waiting for him to prove he was exactly what they'd built him into. What he said next is the reason this story still gets told in that city. If stories like this stay with you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Share it with somebody who needs it tonight. It genuinely helps us keep telling them. Now, let's get back to that ballroom and to the question that changed everything. He said yes, just one word, no louder than the music that had just stopped. Yet the entire room heard it, as clearly as if someone had slammed shut an iron door. Camille Ashford spun around, her lips parting as if she meant to say something. Fausto didn't look at her. In the same even voice he might have used to read a number from a ledger, he told her she should put the earring back in its box before he had to ask who had put it in that apron pocket. Camille stood perfectly still. Her hand closed around the earring so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Warren Ashford took half a step forward, then stopped, because he understood better than his daughter that a man who spoke that quietly wasn't arguing. Fausto lifted his head and looked out over the 200 people standing there. Harbor owners, union chiefs, people carrying family names. The Boston police had been watching for 3 generations, and he said exactly 5 words. "The girl is my guest." No one answered. No one dared. Then he turned his head toward the band in the corner, where 4 men stood like statues with their instruments in their hands, and he said one word. Music. The saxophone came in first, slow and low. Then the piano followed. Fausto lowered his head. He leaned close to the ear of the girl, trembling in his arms, close enough that no one else could hear, and said, 3 minutes. Don't let go of my hand." Sophia didn't nod. She couldn't say anything, but her fingers tightened around his hand until he could feel her nails pressing into his skin, and he let them stay there. He placed his other hand on her back, between her shoulder blades, and began to move. No one danced with them. 200 people stood in a silent circle, and in the middle of that circle was a crime boss, in a black suit, guiding a blind maid one careful step at a time across the stone floor. She didn't know which direction she was moving. She only knew that one hand was holding her, and that a body as steady as a wall was moving in front of her, so she followed. Halfway around, she stepped on his foot. She went rigid, her whole body shrinking inward with the reflex of someone accustomed to being scolded. Fausto didn't stop. He simply shifted his weight and kept moving. The second time, she stepped harder, and this time her lips moved as though she were about to apologize. He still said nothing. The third time, her heel came down squarely on the toe of his shoe, and he bent closer and told her to keep going because he didn't like these shoes very much anyway. For a moment, Sophia didn't understand what she had just heard. Then a laugh escaped her, short and hoarse, almost a sob. And immediately after that laugh, she began to cry. Tears spilled from eyes that couldn't see anything, ran down her chin, and fell onto the front of his black jacket. And she didn't wipe them away because she didn't dare let go of his hand. Fausto drew her a little closer so no one could see her face. They finished the song that way. When the final note faded, someone clapped. Just one person. Then the sound died because no one joined in. Sophia straightened. She drew in a breath, then her knees gave way and she pitched forward. Fausto caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her into his arms, one hand beneath her back and the other beneath her knees, and she was so light that for a second he had to look down to make sure he was carrying a grown woman. Rosalind came forward, leaning on her cane. Fausto told Silas, who had somehow appeared beside him without anyone noticing when, to call an ambulance, and then he spoke a second sentence loudly enough for the entire room to hear. No one leaves this room, not even the Ashfords. A murmur rose and then died away. Warren Ashford remained where he was, his face showing nothing. Camille had sat down in a chair against the wall, both hands resting in her lap, and no one came to sit beside her. Silas went to the door to make the call. Fausto carried the girl across the grand hall, and the 200 most powerful people in Boston automatically separated into two lines to let him pass, exactly as they always did whenever he entered a room, except this time none of them understood what they were making way for. 3 o'clock in the morning, Massachusetts General Hospital. The emergency department hallway glowed white and was almost empty. Sophia lay behind a drawn curtain, an IV needle in her hand, both eyes completely bandaged. Fausto stood outside, speaking with the doctor on duty. Rosalind sat inside on the plastic chair beside the bed, both of her hands resting over the girl's hand. She had been sitting that way for 40 minutes, and she had no intention of going anywhere. She looked at the bandages over Sophia's eyes and thought about all the faces she had forgotten over the past 2 years. The gardener's name, the name of an old friend's daughter-in-law, the name of the street where she had lived as a girl. Then Sophia stirred. She was delirious, her breathing shallow and quick, and she said one sentence. Her voice wasn't the voice of a 27-year-old woman. It was small, high, and trembling. The voice of a child afraid of the dark. "Aunt Rosa, don't turn off the light." Rosalind released her hand as though she had just touched fire. To understand why that name made her pull her hands away, we have to go back 6 weeks. Sophia Bell, 27 years old, was a morning shift maid at the Castellani estate in Brookline. She had worked there for 8 months. Her shift began at 5:30 in the morning and ended at 2 in the afternoon, after which she stayed later whenever the family had guests, and the family almost always had guests. Her personnel file contained the address of a rented room in Alston, a social security number, 2 references, and nothing else worth noticing. She did her job well. She didn't talk much. She was the only member of the household staff who had never asked for a day off. What no one wrote in her file was this. After every party, when the kitchen was being cleaned and untouched trays of food were dumped into the industrial trash bins behind the kitchen, Sophia was the one who carried the bins out. She always volunteered for that job. She lifted the lid, stood with her back to the door, and quickly ate whatever was still clean, usually bread and cheese, sometimes slices of cold meat no one had touched. She ate standing up, in 4 minutes, then washed her hands and went back inside. She did it because every meal she didn't have to buy meant $7 saved, and $7 3 times a week came to $84 a month, and $84 was more than 1/3 of the minimum amount she had to pay the collection agency every month. There were 3 missed calls on her phone from the same number in Ohio. She had stopped answering after the 4th month. She simply transferred the money on the 1st of every month, exactly the minimum payment. Not 1 cent more. And after 11 months, her hospital debt still stood at $41,200, almost exactly where it had begun, because most of what she paid barely covered the interest. In her rented room in Alston, on top of the wardrobe, sat a walnut box, about 16 inches high, containing her mother's ashes. It had been there for 11 months. The smallest burial plot in the nearest cemetery cost $2,800, not including the headstone engraving fee or the annual maintenance fee, and Sophia didn't have $2,800. Nor did she have any way of getting it anytime soon. Every night before turning off the light, she spoke a few sentences to that box. Not many, just enough to hear her own voice in the room. Then she went to bed. But she slept very little. On the nights she stayed late at the estate, and she stayed far more often than she needed to, she didn't sleep at all. She walked. The house was so large that during her first week on the job she got lost twice, and by the 3rd week she had begun counting doors. Not so she could remember her way around. She counted because she needed to know exactly how many places in that house could be used to hide something. The first door was the storage room beneath the east staircase. The 7th was the dressing room connected to the first-floor library. The 19th was the door leading down to the wine cellar, where there were 320 bottles, and a small safe she had seen from a distance. The 27th was Vincent Castellani's old bedroom, now locked and covered in white sheets, a room no one had entered in 12 years. Over 8 months, Sophia had counted all 34 doors. She had managed to get through 33 of them, some with the cleaning crew's master key, some by volunteering for jobs no one else wanted, and some because all she had to do was stand there holding a bucket and a mop, and no one asked her a single question. One door remained. It stood at the end of the second-floor hallway, the 34th door, Vincent Castellani's old study. It was the only room in the house that didn't appear on the cleaning schedule. No one was allowed inside. Margaret Doyle, the head housekeeper, had told her exactly once during her second week that if she ever accidentally opened that door, then it would be better if she never opened it at all, and she had said it with the expression of someone repeating another person's warning. That night, at 3 a.m, Sophia walked the entire second-floor hallway, carrying a stack of clean towels in her arms, so that if anyone saw her, she would have a reason for being there. No one saw her. She stopped in front of the 34th door, set the towels down on the floor, and placed her hand on the brass knob. This was the 9th time. She had tried once in the first month, once in the second, twice during the 4th month, and 4 more times scattered across the months since then, each attempt at a different hour, each time carrying something she could use as an excuse. She turned the knob all the way to the right. It didn't move. She turned it to the left. Nothing. She pressed her shoulder against the door and pushed gently, just enough to feel whether it would give, and the door remained as still as a wall. The lock was old, made of brass, with an oval keyhole, not the kind the master key could open. Sophia stood there for another half-minute, her forehead resting against the wooden frame, her breath clouding a small patch of the polished finish. Then she picked up the towels, walked back down the hallway, and didn't look behind her. There were 30 days left until the engagement party, and Sophia Bell still had no idea how she was going to open the final door. That morning, about 15 miles east of the Brookline estate, Fausto Castellani sat in a small office on the second floor of a warehouse at the Port of Boston, 38 years old, dressed in a black suit, both hands resting on the desk. Across from him sat a man named Whitaker, the owner of a stevedoring company, explaining why the figures in the books for the previous quarter were $410,000 lower than expected. Whitaker talked a great deal. He talked about fuel prices, about 2 containers being held by customs in New Jersey, about a client in Portland who was late with a payment. He talked for 19 minutes. Fausto didn't interrupt him once. He sat perfectly still, looking straight ahead, occasionally giving the smallest nod, and every time he did, Whitaker spoke faster. Silas Marchetti stood with his back against a filing cabinet in the corner, arms folded, saying nothing. When Whitaker finally ran out of things to say, the room stayed silent for about 5 seconds. Then Fausto spoke. He said he had already had the New Jersey customs records checked the previous Tuesday. He paused. Then he said a second sentence, telling the man to go home and call him in the morning. That was all. No threat, no tightening of the face, and his voice was exactly the same one he had used to invite Whitaker to sit down 20 minutes earlier. Whitaker remained seated for another few seconds. Then his face turned a very strange color. He stood up, picked up his briefcase, thanked Fausto twice, and left. The sound of his footsteps going down the iron stairs was noticeably faster than it had been coming up. Silas moved away from the filing cabinet, walked to the window overlooking the container yard, then turned and asked if Fausto wasn't going to do anything about it. Fausto remained exactly where he was, his hands unmoving on the desk. He said Whitaker had just taken care of it himself. Silas didn't ask another question. 45 years old, working alongside the Castellani family since he was 23, Silas understood something that took most people several years to learn. Fausto Castellani almost never had to do anything at all. People did it for him. They confessed on their own, paid on their own, disappeared from the city on their own, chose early retirement on their own, all because they had once sat in a room and heard him tell them in an even voice that he had already had something checked. Downstairs, a new kid in his early 20s was waiting beside the car. He asked Silas whether the boss ever lost his temper, and Silas said no. Almost never. The kid asked how anyone knew when he was angry. Then, Silas opened the car door, stopped, thought for a moment, and gave him one answer. Never ask him to promise you anything, because he'll do it. The kid laughed, thinking it was a joke. Silas didn't. At 7 o'clock that evening, Fausto arrived home in Brookline. He took off his coat and handed it to the servant at the door, walked straight into the dining room, and sat down. The dining table was about 15 feet long, made of dark oak, with 12 place settings and 12 high-backed chairs, spaced in perfectly even intervals. On the tabletop there was exactly one setting, one napkin, one plate, one knife, one fork, one glass of water. Margaret Doyle laid it out just as she had every evening for the past 12 years, at the head of the table, while the other 11 places remained empty. She brought in the food, wished him a pleasant meal, then withdrew and closed the door. Fausto ate alone for about 20 minutes. No music, no television, no phone on the table. The sound of his knife touching the plate echoed through the room and vanished into the 13-foot ceiling. At one point he stopped eating and looked down the row of empty chairs to his right, then continued. When he finished, Margaret came in to clear the table. And she didn't ask whether he wanted dessert because she had stopped asking years ago. At 9 o'clock, he went upstairs. The hallway was dark, lit only by a few dim wall sconces. He passed his mother's room. A ribbon of warm yellow light still showed beneath the door, and from inside came very soft music, an old song, the horn sounding as though it were coming from a record rather than a speaker. Fausto stopped. He stood there with his left hand hanging at his side, his right hand lifting slightly to the level of his waist, before dropping again. He could hear the creak of a chair inside, hear her clear her throat, and then hear her laugh, a short laugh that made it seem as though she were talking to someone. He didn't know who she was talking to. He didn't knock to ask. He stayed there for another 10 seconds or so, then walked on, and the sound of his footsteps faded along the carpet until the door to his room closed at the far end of the hall. Inside, the music kept playing, and the 73-year-old woman sitting there had no idea that her son had just been standing outside her door, just as she had no idea that the girl sitting in the room with her, the morning shift maid folding towels in the chair across from her and laughing at her story, would be the person who changed everything that remained in that house. Rosalind Castellani was 73 years old, and before she married Vincent, she had made her living as a dancer. Now she walked with a cane, took 7 kinds of medication every day, and had begun forgetting people's names. She forgot the gardener's name. She forgot the name of the street where she had rented a room as a young woman. One morning, she called Margaret Helen for 20 straight minutes, and Margaret answered yes, every time without correcting her once, because everyone in that house had agreed that Rosalind mustn't be upset. That was precisely what drove her mad. People spoke to her in the voice they used with children and dogs. They crouched down to bring themselves level with her eyes. They told her how strong she looked today every time she managed to walk from her chair to the window on her own. She hated all of it, and she never said so, because if she did, they would only do it more. Then the morning shift maid walked into her room for the first time. She set down the tray, opened the curtains, and said the tea was stronger than usual today. And if Rosalind didn't like it, she should say so and she'd make another pot. Rosalind looked at her. No coaxing voice, no unnecessary smile. The girl spoke to her exactly as she would have spoken to a woman of 30. Rosalind took a sip and said it was too strong. Sophia took it away and made another pot, and the second one was exactly right. From that day on, Rosalind began paying attention to her. The orchid incident happened during the 3rd week. There was a phalaenopsis orchid on the windowsill in Rosalind's room, and Sophia was the one who watered it. That morning, she lifted the pot to wipe down the sill and saw 3 white pills, 1 pink pill, and 1 crushed pill tucked among the pieces of bark. She set the pot back down. She didn't call anyone. She carried all 5 pills over to where Rosalind was sitting with the newspaper and arranged them in a neat row on the glass table. Rosalind looked down. Then she looked up. Sophia didn't say a word. Rosalind asked what she intended to do. Sophia said, "You take them. I don't tell. You don't take them. I tell." Rosalind lowered the newspaper. She said, "You're blackmailing me." Sophia said yes. There was a silence of about 3 seconds. Then Rosalind gave a quiet laugh and said, "I like you." She picked up the pills one by one, swallowed all 4 that were still whole with half a glass of water, and pushed the crushed one toward Sophia. Sophia asked if there were any more. Rosalind told her to look in the tissue box, bottom compartment. Sophia went to get them, counted 6 more pills, and brought them all out. From that day forward, every morning at 7:15, the 2 women sat facing each other across the glass table. Sophia set the medication packets down. Rosalind took them, and no one else in the house knew that for the first time in 2 years, She was taking every dose she was supposed to take. The third thing was harder to explain. Rosalind had a lifetime of stories from the years when she danced in supper clubs around the South End, and most of them weren't the kind of stories people told over a family dinner. She had tried telling a few of them to other people. Her former nurse had given an awkward laugh and changed the subject. Margaret had turned red and left the room. Someone had even asked whether she was tired, as though the fact that she had used a dirty word was a symptom of something, so she stopped telling them. Until one afternoon, while Sophia was folding towels, Rosalind began telling her about a trombone player named Delaney and what had happened to his pants during the final performance one night at a nightclub on Tremont Street. Halfway through the story, she stopped, waiting for the reaction she had come to expect. Instead, Sophia burst out laughing. Not a polite laugh. She laughed so hard she had to put the towel down and sink onto the edge of the chair, and after a while she even asked whether the poor man had managed to get his pants back on. Rosalind continued. That afternoon, she told 3 stories, each one dirtier than the one before it, and the morning shift maid laughed until real tears ran down her face. When Sophia stood to put the towels away, Rosalind called her back. She told her to sit down. Sophia sat. Rosalind looked at her for a long time, then said that everyone in this house treats me like an expensive antique. They dust me. They put me where the light is just right. They're afraid I'll break. She paused, her hand tightening slightly around the head of her cane. Then she went on. You're the only person in this house who treats me like a living human being. Sophia didn't answer right away. She sat there with both hands resting in her lap, and at last she said, But you are still alive. Rosalind said, I know. The problem is no one else remembers it. From that day on, Rosalind's hours began to revolve around the morning shift. She started waking earlier. She stopped pretending to sleep until 9 o'clock. Some mornings, she told Margaret not to bring up the tea because she was waiting, and there was one thing neither of those women realized. Even though it was happening right in front of them every single morning, Rosalind Castellani still forgot the gardener's name, still forgot the name of the old street, still had afternoons when she sat looking out the window and couldn't remember what she had been about to do. But she never once forgot that girl's name. Camille Ashford arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 32 years old, carrying a wedding coordinator and 2 binders of invitation samples with her. They sat in the small parlor on the first floor to discuss the guest list. Sophia was called in to serve coffee. When she set the tray down, Camille didn't look at her. Camille told the coordinator to have that girl bring more milk. Sophia went to get the milk. When she came back, Camille said, Have that girl pour it. And Sophia poured. Over the next 40 minutes, she was called that girl 7 times. And during those entire 40 minutes, Camille didn't look up at her once. Rosalind sat in the armchair near the window, taking no part in the discussion, only listening. It happened when Camille reached for the second binder of invitation samples. Her elbow struck the cup. It tipped over, coffee spreading into a dark stain across the cream-colored wool rug, and Camille moved her chair back just enough to keep it from touching her dress. Then, in the same calm voice someone might use to ask for a window to be opened, she said that girl should clean it up right away before it soaked in. Sophia set down the milk pitcher, took a cloth from her apron pocket, lowered herself onto one knee, and began blotting the rug. The wedding coordinator looked away. Camille had already turned to the next page of the binder. Then came the sound of a cane striking the hardwood floor. Rosalind rose, took 3 steps toward Sophia, and slipped a hand beneath her elbow. She pulled her to her feet. Sophia started to say something, but Rosalind gave her arm a gentle squeeze, and she fell silent. Rosalind turned to Camille and said that in my house, no one kneels. Camille looked up, needed 1 second to rearrange her expression, then smiled. She said, You care too much about the help. Rosalind said, I care about people. You sort them into categories. The wedding coordinator lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her and didn't look up again. Camille didn't argue. She simply closed both binders, said perhaps it would be better to continue another day, thanked Rosalind for her time, and stood. On her way to the door, she passed Sophia, who was still standing there with the damp cloth in her hand. Camille stopped for half a second. She looked at her, for the first time that entire afternoon, her gaze moving from Sophia's head to her feet, and then back up again. Slowly, without anger, the way someone looks at an object because they want to remember what it looks like. Then she walked out. The coffee stain on the rug later required a professional cleaner, who worked on it for 3 hours, and even then a faint shadow remained. That night, at 2 a.m, Sophia was walking through the first-floor hallway when she heard music. The door to the music room stood slightly open. Inside, the old record player was turning, horn and piano sounding rough and dusty beneath the needle, and Rosalind Castellani was standing in the middle of the room. She had propped her cane against the side of a chair. She was dancing. Not much, only a few steps. Her left hand raised to shoulder height as though someone were holding it, one heel turning slowly against the wooden floor. Sophia stopped in the doorway and hardly dared to breathe. Halfway through a turn, Rosalind's left knee gave way. She lurched sideways, one hand reaching into empty air, and Sophia rushed forward and caught her before she hit the floor, one arm around her back, the other gripping her elbow. For about 2 seconds they stood frozen that way, both breathing hard, while the music kept playing. Then Rosalind tore her arm free. She shouted at Sophia to get out. Her voice shook and was louder than it needed to be. She demanded to know who had let her come in, who had told her to spy on her, and said she didn't need anyone to catch her. Sophia stepped back once, but she didn't leave. She stood there with her hands at her sides and waited. Rosalind gripped the back of the chair, dropped heavily into it, and the anger drained from her face as quickly as it had arrived. She breathed. She looked down at her own hands. A long time passed before she spoke again, her voice back to normal, asking Sophia whether she knew how to dance. Sophia said no, ma'am. Rosalind nodded. She said good. My husband didn't either. I married him anyway. Then she pointed to the chair across from her. Sophia walked over, picked up the cane, placed it back where Rosalind could reach it easily, on the right side where her hand was accustomed to finding it, and sat down. The record kept turning. Neither of them said anything else. At the far end of the hallway, about 50 feet away, Fausto Castellani stood in the shadows. He had just returned from the port, his coat still in his hand, and he had stopped when he heard the music. From where he stood, through the narrow opening in the door, he could see his mother sitting in the chair, and a girl in a maid's uniform sitting across from her. He watched the girl bend down to pick up the cane. He watched her place it exactly beside his mother's right hand, where she was used to reaching for it, without anyone having to tell her. He saw that his mother didn't thank her, and that the girl didn't wait to be thanked. Fausto stood there longer than he intended. Something caught inside his chest, something small and without a name, and he didn't try to understand what it was. He watched for a few more seconds, then he turned away and went upstairs. 3 weeks after the night in the music room came the day of the engagement party. No one in the house called it an engagement. They called it Saturday night, or simply the business at the port, because everyone attending understood what it really was. The Ashford family controlled 3 longshoremen's unions to the south. The Castellani family controlled the container yards and every road leading in. Once those 2 names were joined on a marriage document, not a single piece of cargo would pass through the port of Boston without passing through them, and the 2 families had spent 11 months negotiating this day. The household staff was increased to 40 people. Sophia was assigned to the East Bar, near the corridor leading into the inner hall, where 4 bottles of white wine sat chilling in ice buckets beside a row of glasses already set out. Her job was to pour, replenish the trays, and keep the counter clean. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while she was tying her apron in the servants' hallway, Rosalind came toward her, leaning on her cane. She didn't say hello. She opened her palm, and resting in it was an old tortoiseshell hair clip, its surface dulled with age. She told Sophia to give her hair here. Sophia started to refuse, but Rosalind had already fastened it in place. She adjusted it slightly, stepped back half a pace to look, then told her to stand up straight. Tonight, you're serving people. You're not beneath them. Then she turned away without waiting for an answer. Sophia remained alone in the hallway for about 10 seconds, one hand rising to touch the clip in her hair. Then she picked up her tray and carried it out to the bar. At 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. By 9, the grand hall was packed. Sophia poured without stopping. She couldn't hear much beyond the music and the voices. She didn't know who anyone was. She only knew which kind of wine belonged in which glass when it was handed to her. At 9:20, she poured herself half a glass of water and set it on the inner edge of the counter, close against the base of the row of glasses, where it was hidden from the guests' view. She did that at every party. 3 minutes later, someone passed by the East Bar. Camille Ashford stopped for about 2 seconds to adjust the strap of her shoe, her right hand lowered to the edge of the counter, in a place no one on the guest side could see, then lifted again. Camille straightened. She looked toward Sophia, just once, a brief, calm glance, then continued into the crowd. Sophia didn't see it. At that moment, she was bending down to take the third bottle from the ice bucket. At 9:34, she finished the water in her glass. 20 minutes later, her ears began to ring. At first, it felt like an airplane descending, a pressure thickening behind her eardrums, and the music in the room sounded as though it were coming through water. She swallowed several times. It didn't go away. Then a thin, high-pitched tone appeared in her right ear, steady and unbroken, and the voices around her began to slide farther and farther away. She thought she was tired. She set the bottle down, gripped the counter, and breathed. That was when the light began to disappear. It didn't go black. If it had gone black, she might have understood what was happening. Instead, it faded slowly and evenly, as though someone, somewhere in that house, were gradually turning the entire world down. The blocks of color in the room thinned first, then the edges of everything softened. She looked down at the row of glasses on the counter, and could still see that they were there, but their outlines were vanishing, overlapping one another, dissolving into the surface beneath them. She blinked hard 3 times. After the third, she could no longer tell where the ceiling was. She lifted her hand in front of her face and couldn't see it. There was one very brief moment when she still believed that if she simply stood still long enough, it would pass. She stood still. It didn't pass. All that remained was sound, and sound was everywhere at once. Laughter to her left, glasses touching behind her, heels striking stone, a saxophone coming from a direction she couldn't locate, all of it rushing at her without above or below, front or back. She reached for the edge of the counter and swept her hand through empty air. The tray in her other hand tilted. It fell. The crash of glass breaking against the stone floor rang out terribly loud, and for about 1 second the entire area around her went silent. Sophia dropped one hand toward the floor, groped forward, found the edge of the table, and held on. Wine soaked through her sleeve, cold, running down to her elbow. She called for Margaret. She called loudly, twice, and turned her face toward what she thought was the servants' hallway. But she had lost her sense of direction the moment the tray fell, and the direction she was calling toward was exactly the opposite, straight into the middle of the grand hall, straight toward the 200 most powerful people in Boston, as they turned one by one to look at her. The music stopped in the middle of the song. Then a woman's voice sounded very close by, sweet as cake frosting. The rest of that night, you already know. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Sophia was transferred from the emergency department at Massachusetts General Hospital to Massachusetts Eye and Ear, 2 blocks away. The admitting physician was Iris Lowell, 50 years old, a retinal specialist, and she spent 4 hours and ordered 3 rounds of tests before stepping out of the room to speak with the man waiting in the hallway. She said this was quinine poisoning, and the dose the girl had ingested wasn't the kind of dose that could accidentally be present in any commercially sold drink. The substance attacks the retina. At low doses, people may experience ringing in the ears and blurred vision for a few hours. At a dose like this, the damage was real, and she didn't soften that fact. Fausto asked how long. Iris Lowell said she couldn't answer that. Some patients recovered partially within 3 weeks. Some recovered after 4 months and regained only 1/3 of their vision. Some never recovered at all. She said she knew that wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, but it was the only honest answer she could give, and for the next several weeks, there wasn't a person in the world who could tell him whether Sophia would ever see again. Fausto didn't ask another question. He sat down in a chair outside the room and remained there until full daylight filled the windows. Silas came and went 3 times that morning, and not once did he ask whether Fausto intended to go home. Sophia woke at around 10 o'clock. She lay still for a long time, and while she lay there, she understood what had happened. She didn't panic. She raised a hand and touched the gauze over her eyes, felt the IV line at the back of her hand, then lowered her arm again. She heard someone enter. She asked who was there. Iris Lowell introduced herself, sat beside the bed, and began to explain. She got to about the 15th word before Sophia interrupted her. She asked how much one night here cost. Iris Lowell stopped. Sophia asked again, calmly, telling her that she could just say the number. She could take it. Then she said, "Discharge me. I can't afford this." Iris Lowell told her the hospital bill had already been taken care of. Sophia went quiet. She lay there for about 5 seconds, then asked, Who? The doctor didn't answer because the door opened. Sophia heard footsteps enter the room and stop at the foot of the bed. She knew who it was before he spoke because she remembered that hand, and she remembered the smell of the wool jacket her cheek had rested against for 3 minutes on the dance floor. Iris Lowell left. 2 people remained in the room. Sophia said, "I don't want to owe you anything." There was a silence. Then Fausto said, "You don't owe me. The person who put something in your glass does." Sophia turned her face toward his voice. She asked if he was sure. He said, "I'm sure." She asked if he knew who it was yet. He said not yet, and he said it in exactly the same voice he had used when he told Whitaker to go home and call him in the morning. Sophia heard the difference in that voice, even though she had never sat in the office at the port. She lay still. Fausto stood at the foot of the bed, waiting. He had spent the entire morning outside in the hallway, and he had prepared himself for her to cry, or to ask, "When will I see again?" or "Why me?" And he had prepared himself for the fact that he would have no answer to any of those questions. But Sophia didn't ask anything about her eyes. She asked whether Rosalind was all right. Fausto didn't answer immediately. Sophia continued, her voice a little more urgent now, asking whether Rosalind had been forced to stand for too long the night before, whether she had taken her evening medication, saying, "I left the packets on the glass table in her room, but I didn't get a chance to remind Margaret. She said Rosalind often forgot to take them unless someone sat with her. And if she missed 2 days in a row, she had trouble breathing at night." Then Sophia fell silent and waited. Fausto stood there. He was the man who had listened to another man lie for 19 minutes without changing his expression. He was the man everyone at the Port of Boston believed had stopped feeling anything a long time ago. And for about 10 seconds, in that bright white hospital room, he couldn't say a word, because in the past 8 months, no one in his house, including him, had ever asked whether his mother had taken her evening medication. Finally, he said she was fine. "She's sitting outside. She's been there since 3 o'clock this morning, and she refuses to go home." Sophia breathed out. She said, "Then please tell her to go home for me. Her back hurts if she sits in a plastic chair too long." Fausto said, "I already told her. She won't listen." Sophia smiled faintly beneath the gauze. She said, "Yes, that sounds like her." Silas Marchetti began working the next morning. The tray and the 4 broken glasses from the East Bar had been swept into a trash bag by the cleanup crew sometime near dawn. But because Fausto had ordered that no one leave the estate, the bag was still sitting in the kitchen and hadn't been carried out to the bins outside. Silas had everything packed up again, including the broken pieces. The water glass that had been sitting on the inner edge of the counter couldn't be found. It wasn't in the trash bag, wasn't in the sink, wasn't on any tray. It had disappeared from that house sometime between the moment the tray hit the floor and the moment the ambulance arrived. Silas wrote that down on a sheet of paper and underlined it twice. Then he went down to the security room in the basement. The house had 11 cameras. 9 had recorded normally throughout the night. The 10th, positioned in the corridor leading from the inner hall toward the kitchen, and the 11th, angled down toward the East Bar. Both had a gap in their recordings. 40 minutes. From 9:15 to 9:55 on Saturday night. It wasn't a lost signal, and it wasn't a camera malfunction. That section had been deleted from the storage drive, and the deletion had been carried out locally, on the machine inside the security room, at 11:20 that night, while the ambulance still hadn't even cleared the gates. Silas had the security officer who had been on duty that night brought in. The man swore he hadn't left the room, and he wasn't lying, because the access log showed that the security room door had been opened with a key card at 11:19, and the card wasn't his. Silas carried the printout upstairs. He placed the sheet on the desk in front of Fausto, and pointed to the line containing the card code. The card had been issued to the advisory office. Fausto looked at the paper for about 10 seconds, then raised his eyes. He didn't ask whether Silas was sure. Silas pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, and he said what he had been thinking ever since he picked up that piece of paper downstairs. He said that if you touch this card, you're not touching one person. You're touching 3 unions in the South. They'll stop loading cargo within 24 hours, and the port will shut down for at least 2 weeks. Silas continued, saying that during those 2 weeks, 3 other families from Providence and Hartford would smell blood, and they wouldn't come to offer condolences. Then he said the last sentence more slowly than the others. "You're weighing 1 maid against 600 dock workers." Fausto didn't answer right away. He folded the paper in half, then in half again, and set it at the edge of the desk. He said, "I'm weighing whether I still know who I am." Silas opened his mouth as though he meant to say something more, then stopped. He stood, picked up the stack of files, and walked out. At the other end of the house, Rosalind Castellani wasn't sleeping. She hadn't slept since the night at the hospital. She sat in her room with the record player silent and the window open, and she said those two words aloud. Aunt Rosa. She said them again. She said them in her normal voice, then tried them softer, higher, trembling, trying to recreate exactly the voice she had heard in the emergency room. No one called her that. In her entire life, she had never allowed anyone to call her that except during one particular period she refused to think about now, and every time her memory touched the edge of that time, it slipped away again, the way the name of the old street slipped away, the way the gardener's face slipped away. She knew that she knew. She simply couldn't reach it. At 3:00 in the afternoon, she sent for Margaret Doyle and told her to bring Sophia Bell's personnel file. Margaret asked what she needed to see. Rosalind told her just bring it. Margaret returned with a thin folder. Rosalind put on her glasses and read it from beginning to end, twice. Sophia Bell, 27 years old. An address in Alston. A social security number. Her previous job had been at a restaurant in Somerville, and before that, at a laundry facility in Worcester. 2 references, both of whom had been contacted, and both of whom had confirmed her employment. No criminal record. No unusual notes. Her start date had been 8 months and 9 days earlier. Rosalind turned back to the first page. She stared at the name for a long time. Bell. She said it aloud once. It brought nothing back. Margaret asked whether she was all right. Rosalind said yes, put it away. But when Margaret reached for the folder, Rosalind held onto it for a few seconds longer, before finally letting go. That night, she didn't sleep again. She lay there, listening to the clock in the hallway strike each hour, and inside her head that child's voice kept repeating itself over and over. Aunt Rosa, don't turn off the light, while she lay there trying to remember the last time she had heard it, where she had been, and who had said it. He came on Monday night, then Tuesday night, then Wednesday night, and by Friday night the entire floor had grown used to the sight of a man in a black suit, sitting in the chair beside bed number 4, from 8:00 until around 10. No one asked who he was. The strangest thing, and it took him 3 evenings to realize it, was that Sophia didn't ask either. She didn't lower her head when he entered. She didn't address him formally. She didn't use the voice everyone who worked in his house used. The voice pitched half a note higher and spoken faster than normal. She couldn't see him, so she couldn't see the suit, couldn't see the way people stepped aside for him in the hallway, couldn't see the 2 men waiting at the far end of the floor. She only heard a man walk into the room and sit down. On Wednesday night, before he had even had a chance to speak, she said, "You put your weight on the left side." Fausto stopped halfway through, pulling out the chair. She continued, "Your right knee?" He sat down before answering. He said, "Shrapnel." "When I was 23. Sophia turned her face toward him and asked, "Are you actually telling me the truth?" He said, "You can't see me, so why would I bother lying?" She was quiet for a moment, then said that was the most honest thing she had heard in 8 months of working in his house. From that day on, she began asking questions. She asked how many containers passed through the port of Boston every day. She asked whether he liked his work. She asked what time he ate dinner, and when he said 7:00, she asked alone, and he said yes, and she made no comment. But the following night, she asked, "What did you eat today?" And he realized it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him that. On Saturday night, she asked the question no one in Boston dared ask. She lay facing the ceiling, her hands resting on her stomach, and said, "Have you ever killed anyone?" The room stayed silent for a long time. Sophia didn't take the question back. She lay there and she waited so long that if she had been able to see, perhaps she would have read something on his face. But she couldn't. So all she heard was his breathing change rhythm once. Finally, Fausto said, "That's a question you should ask in the light." Sophia nodded slowly. She said yes. "Then we'll save it for later." And she changed the subject. On Monday night the following week, he brought a thick paper envelope with him. He said, "My mother sent this." Inside were 9 printed dance programs from the 1970s. The paper yellowed with age, the edges worn. He picked up the first one and began to read. Saturday night, March 18th, 1973. Copley Terrace Nightclub. He read down the list of performances. By the 4th act, Sophia burst out laughing. She asked, "Is that really what it's called?" He read it again. Lady Delaney's jerk. She laughed harder. He kept reading, and the titles only got worse. Wild Duck Fever, The Three-Legged Dance, Mr. Kowalski's Long Night. And by the final title, Sophia had to grip the side of the bed. She asked, "Was your mother in Mr. Kowalski's Long Night?" Fausto looked down at the paper. He said, "Her name is on the second line." Sophia laughed so hard that the doctor on duty leaned his head through the doorway to look, then left again. When she finally stopped laughing, she lay quiet for a long while. Then she said, "Do you know what's more frightening than being blind?" Fausto didn't answer. She continued, saying that during her first 3 days there, every time someone came into the room to change the IV, they finished what they were doing and walked out without saying a word. She said she would lie there knowing someone was in the room, hearing them breathe, hearing their shoes on the floor, but no one spoke to her. She said that was the frightening part, not the darkness, knowing people were still there, but no one treated you like a person who was present in the room. She said she had lived that way for 8 months in his house, except back then she could still see, so she hadn't noticed it. Fausto sat in silence. He thought of the 40 people serving at that Saturday night gathering, whose names he didn't know. He thought of Margaret Doyle, who had set his table for 12 years, and how he had never once asked how many children she had. He said, "I'm sorry." Sophia frowned slightly beneath the gauze. She asked, "What are you apologizing for?" He said, "For those 8 months." She didn't say anything. After a while, she said she was thirsty. Fausto stood, poured some water, and was about to place the glass into her hand the way he had every other evening. Then he stopped. He said, "The glass is on the table, about 16 inches from your right hand, with the edge of the table between you and it." Then he took her wrist and guided her hand through the empty space, letting her touch the edge of the table first, then moving farther until her fingers found the side of the glass. He let go. Sophia picked up the glass, drank, and put it back exactly where it had been. She said, "Thank you." Not for the water. That envelope of dance programs had been dug out by Rosalind herself, so her son could take it to the hospital. She found it in the bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet in the music room, a drawer she hadn't opened in years. And when she pulled it out, beneath the stack of programs were 3 photo albums bound in blue cloth. She left them exactly where they were for 2 days. On Wednesday afternoon, when Margaret was the only person downstairs, Rosalind returned to the music room, sat in her chair, and placed the middle album on her lap. She opened it from the beginning. She moved through the years of a house where she had once known every person by name. Summer parties, christenings, faces that now required several seconds of thought before the names returned to her. About 3/4 of the way through, she stopped. It was a photograph taken in the grand hall beneath the Christmas tree. The paper faded to a pale yellow. In the lower right corner, someone had written in ballpoint pen, "December, 18 years ago." In the photograph was her son at 20, his hair longer than it was now, bending very low with both hands wrapped around the tiny hands of a child standing on the toes of his shoes. The 9-year-old girl was laughing, and her son was laughing too, and Rosalind sat very still, looking at that smile for a long time because she couldn't remember the last time she had seen it on his face. The child was the daughter of Daniel Keene, the man who had kept the family's books for 11 years. Rosalind remembered that immediately, without having to search for it. She remembered the mother's name too, Grace, the friend she had once called 3 times a week. Rosalind lifted a finger to the protective glass and traced the outline of the child's face. Then she closed her eyes and built in her mind the face of the young woman lying in the hospital, the face she had looked at every morning for 8 months across the glass table. The bridge of the nose, the distance between the eyes, the slightly square chin. She opened her eyes and looked at the photograph again. Then she stopped comparing, because she didn't need to compare anymore. She had known since that night in the emergency room, from the very second that child's voice came out of the mouth of a delirious woman. It had simply taken her 10 days to allow herself to know. Rosalind leaned back in the chair and let the rest come flooding in. She remembered March of that year, when Daniel Keene failed to come to work, and the following week he still didn't come, and then Vincent called everyone into the dining room and said the accountant had stolen money from the family and run away, and no one was ever to speak that name in this house again. She remembered Grace calling her twice that week, and how she hadn't answered either time. She remembered the small moving truck parked outside a house across the city, and she remembered standing at a second-floor window looking down at it. But what she remembered most clearly, more clearly than anything else, was her son. Fausto had been 20 then. He didn't believe it. He argued with his father. The only time in his life he ever did. And Vincent slapped him in front of 4 men. Then Fausto went looking. He searched for 7 weeks, across the entire city, calling every number he had. And when he returned from the final trip, something in his eyes had gone out. Rosalind remembered the exact day. She remembered him walking into the kitchen near dawn, setting his car keys on the table, and from that day on he didn't speak a single sentence for 5 months. It wasn't anger. He still ate his meals, still went to school, still nodded when someone asked him a question. He simply stopped speaking. And when he finally began to speak again, the person who spoke was someone different, calmer, quieter, and never again capable of laughing the way the young man in that photograph was laughing. Rosalind lowered her eyes to the picture one more time. She knew that all she had to do was carry this album downstairs, place it on the table in front of her son, and say the girl's real last name, and everything would begin. She knew Fausto wouldn't ask twice. She knew he would reopen everything that had happened 18 years earlier. Every ledger page, every number, every living person who had been in this house back then. And she knew, precisely and without the slightest uncertainty, who he would reach if he dug deep enough. She sat there for a very long time in the room, after the sunlight had faded. Then she closed the album. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries before she managed to fasten the brass clasp along the edge of the cover. She returned it to the bottom drawer, pushed the drawer shut, and settled back into her chair as though she had never stood up at all. That evening, when Fausto came home and stopped by to ask whether she needed anything, she said no. She asked how she was today. He said she laughed more than yesterday. Rosalind nodded and said, "That's good." Then she turned her face toward the window and kept it there until he left. On Friday morning, Warren Ashford arrived at the Brookline estate without warning. 66 years old, the family advisor since Vincent was still alive, he was the only person in that house allowed to walk directly into the first-floor study without being escorted. He sat down, placed his briefcase on his lap, and said he wanted to move the wedding date forward. Fausto asked how much earlier. Warren said 6 weeks. Without waiting for a reaction, he continued, saying that people in the 3 southern unions had begun asking one another what was going on, and when people started asking questions like that, within a month someone else would answer them instead. Then he placed both hands on top of his briefcase and said the sentence he had prepared before he ever got into the car. He said, "You just let 200 people watch you choose a maid. Now you have to show them you're still thinking clearly." Fausto didn't answer. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the desk, and looked at Warren Ashford exactly the way he had looked at Whitaker for 19 minutes in the warehouse at the port. Warren waited. Nothing came. Finally he stood, said he would have someone send over the schedule, and walked out. When the door closed, Fausto remained in the same place for nearly 20 more minutes. On the desk in front of him lay the printout of the access card code Silas had given him, now unfolded and smoothed flat again. He hadn't called off the engagement. He knew exactly what would happen if he ended it now, when all he had in his hands was a sheet of paper with a card code on it and a missing glass. Calling off the engagement now wouldn't be a decision. It would be a declaration of war, and the price would be paid first by 600 men at the port, not by him. So he folded the paper again and put it into a locked drawer. On Saturday afternoon, Camille Ashford came to Massachusetts' Eye and Ear. She signed the visitor log, went up to the 4th floor, and no one stopped her because she didn't look like someone who needed to be stopped. She knocked softly twice and stepped inside. Sophia asked who was there. Camille pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "It's me, Camille. I heard you were here, so I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." She spoke gently and slowly, in the voice people genuinely used when visiting someone who was ill. Sophia lay still. Camille asked whether her eyes were any better. Sophia said the doctor had told her they had to wait. Camille said, "Yes, waiting is fine. The important thing is that you rest and get stronger." Then she was silent for several seconds, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed into something lighter, almost intimate. She said she'd just come from a dress fitting. She said the dress was ivory, not white, because white washed out her skin. She said the bodice was made of Chantilly lace ordered from France, sewn by hand, requiring more than 400 hours of work. And if Sophia touched it, she would feel that it wasn't like ordinary lace. It was finer, almost like thread. She said the train was 6 feet 11 inches long, and when she walked up the steps, it spread behind her like a fan. She described the way the light passed through the outer layer of tulle. She described the color of the beads at the cuffs, comparing them to the inside of a seashell. She talked for about 4 minutes, patiently and in detail, leaving nothing out, for a woman lying there with both eyes covered in bandages, who couldn't even see her own hand. Sophia didn't say a single word during those 4 minutes. When Camille finished, the room fell silent. Camille stood, pushed the chair neatly back against the wall like a considerate guest, and said she'd better leave so Sophia could rest. She walked to the door, then she stopped. Sophia heard her shoes stop against the floor and knew she had turned around. Still in that same gentle voice, Camille said, "You should pray your eyes never come back. Some things are easier to live with when you can't see them." Then the door closed. The sound of her heels faded along the hallway until it disappeared completely. Sophia lay still in the room for about half an hour. She didn't press the call button for a nurse. She didn't say anything to Iris Lowell when the doctor came in for her afternoon examination. That evening, Fausto arrived as he did every night, sat down in the same chair Camille had occupied 4 hours earlier, and asked how she had been that day. Sophia said fine. He asked whether anyone had come to see her. She said no. She lied not because she was afraid. She lied because she had already done the calculation. She was a maid. The other woman was his fiancée. Sophia couldn't see anything well enough to testify to it. There had been no one else in the room, and people would ask whether she was sure. And she knew what it felt like to answer that question, because 18 years earlier, she had sat in another room and listened to her mother answer it for 2 men who had never intended to believe her. So Sophia said no one had come, and Fausto believed her. On Sunday, Fausto had Sophia's room in the servants' quarters cleared out so her belongings could be moved somewhere else in the house, because he had no intention of letting her return to that wing when she was discharged from the hospital. 2 of Silas's men handled the packing. They folded her clothes, boxed her shoes, and when they lifted the old suitcase from beneath the bed, something in the bottom made an odd sound. Silas had it opened. Beneath the lining was a false compartment, and inside that compartment were 3 things. The first was an Ohio driver's license bearing her photograph, but the name on it was Sophia Keene. The second was a photocopied file about 40 pages thick, a copy of a Boston Police Department missing person report dated March, 18 years earlier, with Daniel Keene listed as the missing person. The third was a large sheet of paper folded into quarters, a hand-drawn floor plan of all 3 stories of the Brookline estate, with every door numbered. There were 34 boxes on the diagram. 33 had been crossed out. The one remaining box, at the end of the second-floor hallway, had been circled twice in ink, and beside it were 2 words, Vincent's study. Silas carried everything upstairs. He placed it all on the desk without comment, then stepped back. Fausto looked at the driver's license first. Then he looked at the floor plan. He studied it for a very long time, longer than he spent on the 40-page file. And during that entire time, Silas said nothing, because he was watching the very thing he had warned about from the beginning take shape in black ink on white paper. A person had entered the house under a false name. A person had gone through 33 doors over 8 months and had only 1 left. A person had known exactly where Vincent Castellani's study was before she ever stepped inside that house. Silas asked, "What do you want me to do?" Fausto said nothing. Then he picked up the driver's license, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and went out to the car. 1 o'clock in the morning, 4th floor of Massachusetts, Eye and Ear. Sophia wasn't asleep. She heard the door open and recognized the footsteps immediately, and she smiled faintly because he had never come at this hour before. She asked, "Don't you sleep?" He didn't answer. She heard the chair pull out, heard him sit down. Then she felt his hand take hers, place it against the edge of the table as he did every night, and guide her fingers until they touched the side of the water glass. She picked up the glass, but she didn't drink, because something in the room was wrong. He was still holding her hand. He didn't let go the way he always did. Then he asked, "What is your name?" Sophia set the glass down. She lay still for about 3 seconds. She couldn't see his face, so she didn't know how he was looking at her, and perhaps that was exactly why she was able to say it. She said, "My name is Sophia Keene." Then she told him everything. She said her father was Daniel Keene, the man who had kept the Castellani family's books for 11 years. She said that one morning in March, 18 years earlier, he had gone to work and never come home, and 3 days later her mother was told that he had taken the family's money and run away. She said her mother had asked questions, made calls, come to the gates of this house twice, and the second time someone came out and told her that if she came back again, it wouldn't be good for her or for her daughter. She said 3 weeks later, mother and daughter left Boston, changed their last name to her mother's maiden name, moved to Ohio, and lived there for 17 years. She said her mother died 11 months ago, and among the things she left behind was a handwritten sheet of paper she had kept for 18 years, containing 3 account numbers she didn't understand, copied from a scrap of paper found in her husband's coat pocket. She said she came back to Boston with that sheet of paper. She said she applied for work as a maid because that was the only way someone like her could get through those gates. She said 8 months, 34 doors, and she had tried the final door 9 times. Then she stopped. He was still holding her hand. She continued more slowly, saying, "My father didn't take a single cent from your family. He died because someone decided killing him was faster than checking the books again. Fausto said my father told me he took it." Sophia turned her face toward his voice. She said, "Your father also told my mother he would be all right." The room stayed silent for a very long time. She waited. She had prepared herself for shouting, for him to ask what proof she had, for him to call someone into the room. None of that happened. The only thing she heard was the faint sound of him breathing out. Then she felt his fingers open. He lowered her hand onto the blanket carefully, exactly the way he always returned the water glass to its place, and he let go. The chair moved backward. His footsteps crossed the room in 3 steps, stopped at the door, then continued. The door closed very softly. Sophia lay there in the darkness, one hand still resting on the blanket where he had placed it, and she didn't call him back. 9 days later, Iris Lowell removed the bandages for the last time and discharged Sophia from the hospital. Her vision at that point was about 20%. She could tell light from darkness. She could make out shapes, see human figures moving, see the window as a blurred patch of brightness against the gray wall. She couldn't read. She couldn't recognize a person's face from about 3 feet away. Iris Lowell told her that 20% after 3 weeks was a good sign, and that it was also possible this was all the vision she would ever have, and she said both things in the same sentence, because she didn't want Sophia holding on to the first half. Sophia thanked her, signed the papers, and left on the bus. No one came to pick her up. She returned to her rented room in Allston. On top of the wardrobe, the walnut box was still exactly where it had been for almost a year, and Sophia reached up to find it with her hands before she did anything else. She no longer had a job. No one called to tell her she had been dismissed, and no one called to tell her that her position was still being held. She had $211 left in her account. Outside the rooming house, across the street, a dark-colored car had been parked there since the afternoon she returned, and there were 2 men inside. They changed shifts at 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. They didn't knock on her door. They didn't follow her when she went out, except that one of them would walk about 100 feet behind her, before turning back. Sophia knew who they were. She also knew who had sent them. Fausto Castellani had told her she would be safe, and he was keeping that promise, hour by hour, without missing a single minute. But he didn't come. 9 days, then 12, then 15, and not once did he step through that door. Sophia didn't send him a message. She didn't ask the 2 men in the car to pass one along. She didn't stand at the window looking down. She did what she had been doing for 18 years. She kept searching. 3 times a week, she took the bus to the Boston Public Library in Copley Square. She sat in the reference section on the 2nd floor and asked the librarians to read for her. She didn't tell them why. She simply handed them a piece of paper with what she needed written in large letters: public civil court records from that year, indexes of commercial lawsuits involving maritime shipping, old local newspaper reports from March and April 18 years earlier. She sat there from 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She took out a handheld recorder and asked people to read into it. At night, back in her room, she listened again, rewound, listened again, and wrote everything into a notebook in large, clumsy handwriting that even she had to bend close to read. Some days she sat there for hours and found nothing. Some days a librarian misread a string of numbers, and she had to return the next day to hear the whole thing again from the beginning. On the 17th day, she found the name of a shipping company that had been dissolved in Providence, and she wrote it in her notebook, and she had no idea what it meant. She wrote it down anyway. In Brookline, on Thursday evening, Rosalind sent for her son and asked him to come upstairs. She told him to close the door. Then she said, "I know who she is." Fausto stood beside the window without turning around. Rosalind said, "She's Daniel Keene's daughter." He said, "I already know." Rosalind nodded slowly. She had prepared herself for that answer. What she hadn't prepared for was the question that came next. Fausto turned around and asked, "How long have you known?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He asked again, still in that same even voice, "How long have you known?" Rosalind looked down at her 2 hands resting on the head of her cane. She thought of the night in the emergency room, of the 10 sleepless days, of the afternoon she had sat in the music room with the album on her lap and tried 3 times to fasten the brass clasp. And she thought of something else, too. Something lying in a locked drawer about 13 feet from where she sat. Something she had kept longer than all of those things put together. She couldn't answer either question. Fausto waited. He waited longer than necessary, and it was the waiting that hurt her most. Then he said, "All right," and walked out. The door didn't close hard. Rosalind remained alone in the room. She heard his footsteps descending the stairs, heard the front door, heard the car engine start outside. Then the house went silent. She sat that way for a very long time. And this time she didn't turn her face toward the window as she usually did. She turned toward the hallway, toward the staircase, toward the music room downstairs, where there was a wooden cabinet with its bottom drawer closed, and she kept looking in that direction until the last of the daylight was gone. 3 nights later, Rosalind sent for her son and asked him to come down to the music room. She had been sitting there since 9 o'clock, with only 1 lamp on and the record player silent. Resting on her lap was an ivory-colored envelope about half the size of a sheet of paper, still sealed. When Fausto walked in, she didn't say anything. She simply held it out to him. He took it. He looked at the handwriting on the front, and his entire body went still, because it was his father's handwriting, and there were only 3 words written there. For Rosalind. She said he gave it to me 15 years ago. He lived another 3 years after that. Fausto sat down in the chair across from her, opened the envelope, and pulled out 4 sheets of paper. He read, Vincent Castellani had written that 3 years after Daniel Keene disappeared, he quietly had an outsider audit every one of the family's books from beginning to end without telling anyone in the house. The result was on the 2nd page. Not a single dollar had left the family through Daniel Keene's hands. Not one transaction. The money that had been taken out had moved through 3 intermediary accounts, opened through a shipping company in Providence that was no longer operating, and all 3 accounts had been approved by 1 man. Vincent wrote that man's name in capital letters twice, as though he were afraid he himself might somehow misread it. Warren Ashford. On the 3rd page, he wrote that Keene had known. Keene had discovered the flow of money 8 months before he disappeared, and during those 8 months, he had gone to Vincent 3 times, not to accuse anyone, to persuade him. Keene wanted Vincent to take the entire family out of the underworld, move everything into legitimate shipping, clean the books within 5 years, and he had even brought a complete plan with him. Vincent wrote that he had laughed in Keene's face the 3rd time. 3 weeks later, Warren Ashford came to him with a stack of documents and said the accountant was stealing. Vincent wrote that he hadn't checked again. He believed the man who spoke faster. The last page contained only 1 short paragraph. He wrote that I killed a decent man because I believed the word of someone who spoke faster. I have lived with that for 3 years, and I haven't had the courage to make it right. Making it right means war. It means losing the port. It means I may lose the boy. I can't do it. I'm leaving it to you. You're braver than I am. Fausto read all 4 pages. Then he read them again from the beginning. The only sound in the room was paper turning. When he lowered the final page onto his lap, Rosalind said, I kept it for 15 years. She continued, saying that for all those 15 years I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself you were too young, that you weren't strong enough yet, that I would wait 1 more year. Then you became strong, and I told myself again to wait 1 more year. She stopped, and when she spoke the next sentence, her voice didn't tremble. The truth is, I was afraid. Fausto said nothing. Rosalind reached down beside the chair, lifted the blue cloth-bound album already open to that exact page, and placed it on the table between them. She pushed it toward him. He looked down. He looked for a very long time. He didn't pick it up, didn't touch the protective glass, didn't ask where she had kept it, didn't ask why she hadn't told him sooner. Both of his hands remained on his thighs, and the only thing that changed was his breathing. It slowed, then stopped completely for about 3 seconds. Then he asked. He asked 1 question, and it was the only question he asked during the entire 20 minutes he sat in the music room that night. He said, Does she still remember? Rosalind looked at her son. She said, My boy, she remembers enough to spend nearly a year working as a maid in the house of her enemy. Fausto turned his face away. She continued. And she spoke slowly, because she had prepared this sentence longer than all the others. She said, I don't regret my life, Fausto. I had a good life in this house. I don't regret the man I married. And I don't regret the son I gave birth to. She placed one hand on the head of her cane. I regret letting fear make my decisions for me. The room remained silent for a long time. Then she said the final sentence, and she said it while looking directly into his eyes. Don't mistake caution for courage. I've made that mistake for 15 years. Fausto stood. He folded the 4 sheets of paper, placed them back inside the envelope, and held it in his hand. He had taken 2 steps toward the door when Rosalind called him back. She said, there is one more thing. He stopped. She said I had Margaret take something to the girl. Fausto turned around. She said I made a copy of 1 page from the old ledger, the page with the 3 Providence account numbers, and I told Margaret to put it directly into her hands 4 days ago. She said I thought if she could take that into court, she could clear her father's name, without needing you, without needing this house, without anyone having to shed blood. I thought that was the right thing to do. Fausto looked at his mother. He asked what day did Margaret give it to her. Rosalind said Monday. He said today is Friday. Then he walked out of the music room, and this time he moved very quickly. Fausto called Silas on his way out to the car and told him to get to Alston. He arrived just before 10 o'clock. The 2 men stationed outside said she had left the house around noon, taken a bus heading south, and when they asked where she was going, she said the library. Fausto went upstairs. The door to her room was unlocked. Inside, it was nearly empty. The walnut box was still on top of the wardrobe. On the table lay an open notebook filled with large, clumsy handwriting, and on the final page were 3 strings of numbers, written and rewritten 4 times, each version darker than the one before it. The photocopy Margaret had brought her was gone. Fausto stared at the notebook for about 3 seconds, then turned and walked out. Silas asked where they were going. He said South Boston. Warren Ashford's office was on the 6th floor of an old building on Congress Street, above an insurance company and 2 small accounting firms. After 7 o'clock in the evening, the building was almost completely empty. Sophia arrived there at 4:30 in the afternoon and waited in the coffee shop across the street until the light beyond the windows shifted into a shade she recognized as late afternoon. Then she crossed the street, entered the lobby, and asked where the elevator was. She went up to the 6th floor. She carried nothing except an envelope containing the photocopy and a phone in her coat pocket, which had been recording since she was still sitting in the coffee shop. The office door was open. Warren Ashford was there alone. He looked at her standing in the doorway, one hand still resting against the frame to orient herself, and he understood immediately who she was. He told her to come in. Sophia entered, felt around for the chair, and sat down. She asked, "Do you remember my father?" Warren didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the liquor cabinet in the corner, poured himself a drink, and in the quiet room, the sound of the liquor flowing into the glass was perfectly clear. Then he sat down again and said, "Little girl, you're blind. You're on the 6th floor, and no one knows you're here." Sophia said, "I know." She placed the envelope on the desk and pushed it toward him. Warren opened it, looked at the photocopied page, and gave a quiet laugh. He asked, "Did the Castellani women give you this?" He took a drink, and then he began to talk. He talked because sitting in front of him was a 27-year-old woman who couldn't see, who had come alone, who carried nothing but a photocopied sheet of paper. And in Warren Ashford's mind, someone like that wasn't a person sitting in the room. She was an empty chair. He said those 3 accounts were his, and he had been using them since before she was born. He said her father had been a very capable man, and that had been exactly the problem, because a capable man would notice when the numbers didn't match, and a decent man wouldn't stay quiet. He said he had brought the documents to Vincent one afternoon in March, and all he had needed was 15 minutes of conversation. He said Vincent Castellani was the kind of man who made decisions very quickly and checked them very slowly, and that was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He went on to say that 3 weeks later, everything was finished, and he hadn't needed to get his hands involved in anything at all. He had only talked. Then he set down his glass and told her to go home, that she couldn't prove anything, and if she came back there again, no one would help her. At that exact moment, the sound of the elevator stopping on the 6th floor came from the hallway. The doors opened. Warren Ashford turned his head. Fausto Castellani walked into the room, with Silas behind him. Warren shot to his feet. He began the first sentence of an explanation, and Silas raised his own phone, its screen glowing. A call already in progress. Sophia took the phone from her coat pocket and placed it on the desk. Both devices were running. Fausto didn't take another step forward. He stood about 10 feet from the desk, both hands hanging at his sides, and said, "I heard everything." Warren Ashford couldn't say another word. He stood there with one hand still resting on the desk, and during those 10 seconds, he finally understood that the empty chair he had been talking to for 12 minutes was a person sitting in the room. Fausto walked around the desk to Sophia and held out his hand. She found it and stood. In the car on the way back, no one spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Sophia broke the silence. She said, "I know what you're thinking." Fausto didn't answer. She said, "Don't kill anyone because of me." He kept looking straight through the windshield. She continued, slowly and clearly, saying, "My father died because someone thought killing him was faster than finding the truth. If you do the same thing, then the last 18 years meant nothing." The car traveled a long distance in silence. Then Fausto spoke to Silas without turning his head. "Call everyone. Tonight, at 2 o'clock in the morning, inside a restaurant in the North End that had already closed for the night, 11 men sat around a long table. 4 were from Boston, 3 from Providence, 2 from Hartford, and 2 more sat at the far end to serve as witnesses. Fausto Castellani sat at the head of the table. Warren Ashford sat in the chair assigned to him, 4 seats away, and he was there because in that world, when an arbitration was called, the person whose name had been summoned wasn't permitted to stay away, and if he did, his absence was already an answer. Camille Ashford sat against the wall behind her father. No one invited her to the table. Fausto placed 3 things on the tabletop. The first was the 4 handwritten pages from Vincent Castellani, and he passed them around one person at a time without reading them aloud, allowing each man to recognize the handwriting for himself. The second was the photocopied ledger page containing the 3 Providence account numbers. The oldest man from Providence picked it up, read it, then set it down and said exactly one sentence, that he knew this shipping company. The third was the recording. Silas placed the device in the center of the table and pressed play. 12 minutes. No one interrupted. Warren Ashford's voice filled the closed room, recounting that afternoon in March, 18 years earlier, in the tone of a man explaining a reasonable business decision. When the recording ended, Silas picked up the device and told the entire table that Massachusetts required both parties to consent to a recording. In court, this would be worthless. No one could use it. He set the recorder back down, but at this table tonight, it was everything. Warren Ashford said it was fabricated, that a blind girl carrying a recorder and setting a trap for an old man proved nothing. Silas took 2 more files from his case. The first contained the hospital toxicology results, signed by the physician, clearly identifying the substance and the dose. The second contained images from the 40 minutes of camera footage the technical team had recovered from the storage drive 3 days earlier. Silas opened his laptop and played it. The picture wasn't very clear, but it was clear enough. The East Bar. A woman stopping for about 2 seconds to adjust the strap of her shoe, her right hand lowering to the edge of the counter, lifting again, straightening up, turning her head for one brief look, then walking away. Silas said, "This is different. This can go to court." The room fell silent. Then Warren Ashford pushed his chair back half a step and said he knew nothing about that his daughter had acted alone, that he hadn't taught her to do such a thing. He said those 3 sentences, one after another, speaking to the entire table without once turning to look behind him. Camille Ashford listened to every word. Then she laughed, a short, dry sound, and the entire room turned toward her. She said, "I did it because you taught me that anyone who is loved more has to be removed from the table." She said that woman liked her more than me. Everyone in that house could see it. Then she went silent, and she didn't say another word for the rest of the night. Fausto stood. He said judgment. Warren Ashford was expelled from every alliance from Boston to Hartford. No protection, no contracts, no door left open to him, and anyone who sheltered him would answer for it themselves. No one objected. Then Fausto announced the second part, and that was the part that left the entire table stunned. He said the complete poisoning case, including the 40 minutes of camera footage and the toxicology results, would be turned over to the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office and the Brookline Police Department the following morning. A chair creaked. The man from Hartford said, "If you do that, the police will tear your estate apart. They'll tear apart the party, the guest list, Everyone sitting at this table. Fausto said, I know. He said the port will be lost. Contracts will be lost. The family will shrink to half its size or smaller. Then he said the final part. 18 years ago, a man brought my father a plan to take this family out of the underworld within 5 years. My father laughed in his face. 3 weeks later, that man was dead. He placed Vincent's 4 pages on the table one last time. I'm going to do the thing he died for, Silas said, quietly enough that only the two of them could hear. You're cutting off your own hand. Fausto said, I'm cutting away the part that kept cutting other people. 3 days later, in the afternoon, Fausto drove Sophia to an old cemetery in Quincy. In Vincent's letter, written in pencil along the margin of the 3rd page, was one line containing the name of the cemetery and a number. Plot 41 lay in the outermost row, where the grass had grown ankle-high. The marker was flat, gray, and completely blank. Sophia knelt and placed her hand on the stone. She ran her fingers across the entire surface from one edge to the other, twice, searching for an engraving she already knew wasn't there. Then she sat back on her heels. She didn't cry. She said, I searched for 18 years just to know my father wasn't a thief. That was all I wanted. Fausto stood behind her in silence for a long time. Then he said, there will be a name on that stone. I promise. 2 weeks later, Rosalind Castellani suffered heart failure at 4 o'clock in the morning. She was rushed to the emergency room and remained in the hospital for 4 days. On the 4th day, when she was able to sit up on her own, she told Fausto to go outside and asked Sophia to sit in the chair beside the bed. Sophia sat down. Rosalind took her hand, and she didn't talk about Daniel Keene, didn't talk about the envelope, didn't say a single word about 18 years ago. She talked about Grace. She said, your mother used to call me 3 times a week. She said your mother called me twice during that week, and I didn't answer either time. She said I stood at the 2nd floor window and watched the little moving truck parked outside your house, and I watched until it disappeared from sight. Then I turned around and went downstairs to dinner. Her voice was very calm. She said I let them send your mother away from the door, and I didn't get up. She said I lived 73 years in that house, and the only thing I am truly ashamed of isn't what my husband did, and it isn't what I knew. The only thing I am ashamed of is that I stayed seated. Then she said, I'm sorry. Sophia shook her head and said, you don't have to call me a servant anymore. Rosalind tightened her hand around Sophia's. She said, I never called you that. I only let other people call you that. That's worse. 6 days after she came home, Rosalind insisted on going down to the music room. Sophia placed a record on the turntable. The song began slowly, the horn rough beneath the dust on the needle. Rosalind pushed herself to her feet with her cane. Half a beat in, her knees softened. Fausto caught her on one side, Sophia supported her on the other, and for about 10 seconds there were 3 people in that room, one cane propped against a chair, and one 73-year-old woman absolutely refusing to admit that 2 people were holding her up. She snapped at them to let go. Neither of them did. Then her shoulders straightened. Her feet found the rhythm, and the weight pressing down on their arms slowly began to lessen. Fausto let go first. Sophia let go second. Rosalind Castellani managed 4 beats alone in the middle of the music room. On the 5th, she stopped, took Sophia's hand, and placed it in her son's. She said, your turn. 1 year later, the wedding was held in an old social hall in the North End, not at the estate. About 60 people attended. By then, Castellani Shipping had paid its taxes in full for 3 consecutive quarters and had shrunk to 1/3 of its former size, and Silas Marchetti spent most of the reception complaining that at 46 years old, he was being forced to learn accounting software, whose interface had clearly been designed by people who had never done a real day's work in their lives. Camille Ashford had received an 8-year prison sentence for attempted poisoning, while her father watched the remainder of his empire crumble away from an unlisted apartment in New Jersey. The stone at Plot 41 in Quincy now carried a name, and beside it there was another name as well, because Sophia had brought her mother home to rest beside her father that March. Her vision had recovered to about 85%. She could read, she could drive during the day, and things still blurred when she was tired. Rosalind was weaker than before. Some days she forgot a guest's name seconds after being introduced, but when the band was about to begin the first song, she raised one hand and said, I believe the boy owes me this dance. Fausto helped his mother onto the floor. They made it through a few slow steps, and she remembered every one of them. Then she stopped, turned, and said, your turn. Sophia stepped forward. Halfway around, she stepped on his foot, and she did it deliberately. Fausto looked down and said, "I don't like these shoes very much either." She laughed. She asked 3 minutes? He said no. This time, I'm not letting go. The following morning, Fausto unlocked the 34th door at the end of the second-floor hallway, the study no one had entered in 12 years. Together, they opened the heavy curtains to let the sunlight flood every dark corner, finally laying the ghosts of the past to rest. Fausto Castellani had spent 18 years believing that what he had lost was a person. What he had really lost was the ability to see other people as human beings, instead of as functions, positions, names on a personnel list. And the person who gave that ability back to him was a girl who couldn't see anything at all. A person's dignity doesn't depend on where they stand in the room, whether they're the one serving or the one being served, the one pouring the wine or the one sitting at the head of the table. Staying silent in the face of something wrong, even when that silence comes from fear, is still a choice. And people pay for that choice, sometimes for the rest of their lives. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't to act quickly, but to stop long enough to make sure they aren't destroying an innocent person. This story leaves us with something very simple. Remember the name of the person who serves your table. Look into the eyes of the housekeeper, the security guard, the delivery driver, and say something kind to them, because respect doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins by acknowledging that the person standing in front of you is also a human being who is present in this room. And if there is someone in your life who is growing old, speak to them as you would speak to someone who is still alive, not as though they were something fragile that might break. And you, if you had been Rosalind, would you have had the courage to open that envelope sooner? Or would you also have chosen to remain silent for 1 more year? How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, has there ever been a time when you regretted staying seated when you should have stood up? Leave a few lines in the comments below. We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your hearts. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it with the people you love, so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.